But we have a pretty good size video today, so we gotta jump into this. So they're not. That's okay. I'm used to it now. All right. So as we ask every week, how have you seen God blessing you or God working in your life?
Rain.
The rain right now. I was standing outside earlier before people started showing up. I was just staring into the sky, watching the lightning bolts. It's just amazing what God can do. So it's always a God thing. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. All right. What else?
Did you schedule a rainstorm?
No, those are Bernard's.
Did you have something, Laura?
Yeah, so last week my uncle had to have a leg replacement, and
Wow.
my sweet husband went for a week to help take care of him. And
That's awesome.
it was
Well,
definitely a blessing in my uncle's life. And
Well, great job. Great job. Is he? I had not heard that one. Okay. Lens replacement. Still good, but yeah. All right. Very good. Anybody? Yes, sir.
I was talking to my friend yesterday, and in the day, corn used to make 100 bushels an acre. His ground had 230 bushels.
Wow.
Believe
200
that? How much that's changed?
over double. That's amazing.
West or north, well, they 63rd rock.
Yeah. My understanding is when the corn was coming up, just the right amount of rain kept hitting it, and it really just popped really well. So
watching, we got soccer.
yeah, that's good. All right, one more, and then we got to jump in. You wrote yours out. Wow. That's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to read what Mary wrote here. It says, I have multiple doctors who... You okay with me reading this, right? Okay. I have multiple doctors who look over my health and well-being. I have a family who loves and looks after me. I have a Christian family who prays for me. I have a library full of books to enrich my mind. If I don't do it on Facebook, I have the freedom to criticize my government and its members. I have a dog that hangs on my every word. Some of my blessings this week: I have plenty and variety of food to eat. I have a comfortable home with heat and AC. AC was a true blessing this week. I have a reliable car and can afford gasoline for it so far. I have adequate clothing for each season. I am free to worship when and where I please. I have multiple Bibles and study aids. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for putting some thought into that. Great reminders for us all. Okay, when you think of Abraham and Sarah, what comes to mind? Old, obedient, what else? Huh? Maybe? Impatient. Okay, go with that. What do you mean? Because that tracks with what I'm wanting to go to.
God gave them a promise, and they wouldn't wait for God's timing, and they tried to do it.
Yeah, so the promise came, you're going to have a son, right? You're going to have offspring. And they were, as someone said, old. The promise wasn't being fulfilled in what they thought was supposed to be the timing. And so they took it in their own hands. And man, what a mess it made. And so God's timing, they were impatient. How emotional of a moment would it be when Isaac came into this world? Can you imagine the elation? Can you imagine the praise to God? Their songs, their prayers, the way they talked to other people about God. Every time they showed their baby boy, everybody wants to see the baby. Every parent wants to show off their child. But this one came with a miraculous promise that everyone doubted, including them. And so the joy, the worship, the praise, it would have been amazing. Now, what would be your reaction when God says, go sacrifice?
You gotta be kidding.
Exactly. What in the world? I mean, if you want to wrestle with your faith, this is the moment of God giving that promise, God delivering on that promise, even when you started maybe having your doubts of that promise. And now that He's finally in your arms, go sacrifice Him. It would have been mental wrestling for Abraham. And it makes you wonder, how much did he let Sarah know prior to heading towards Mount Moriah region that God tells him to do? So let's read the text to Genesis 22, and then we're going to jump into the video The Mount Moriah region is very important. A lot of significant moments throughout biblical history took place at Mount Moriah. So Genesis 22, we will start in verse 1. Come in, come in. All right, audio visual guys here. Everything okay? Okay, all right. Didn't know if anything was wrong. All right, Genesis 22, beginning in verse 1. Love hearing those Bible pages turn. All right. It says, sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Now, Abraham would not have been a stranger to burnt offerings, and so he understood the process that would have taken place. But those were animals. And so now, this is supposed to be his child. Verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, okay, so how much mental wrestling has there been over 3 days? God tells him to go. He's got all night to think about it, and now it's a 3-day journey. It says, on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So, Isaac's no baby anymore, is he? Because Isaac is able to go to this region of Moriah, which is a mountain, Mount Moriah, carry the wood on his back, and so this is no toddler anymore. It says, as the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. That is so beautifully significant, whether or not he realized what he was saying. God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. Verse 9, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. What do you think Isaac's doing in this moment? The panic, the confusion, the questioning, the pleading. It says, then he reached out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. Where is it at? In a thicket, in a thorn bush, a ram with thorns around his head. Sound like anything you know of? Jesus wearing the crown of thorns, the lamb that God provided. This is no accident. This is no accident. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. That's called a substitution. Verse 14, so Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Okay, so that's one event that took place in the region of Mount Moriah. And we're about to watch a video that explains other things that took place there as well, including what we just had pointed to here. It was in that very region. And so we will start our video because of our lack of time to get it all in.
This is Mount Moriah, where over the course of some 4,000 years of history, 2 altars, 3 temples, and 2 shrines have been built. This is the place that is where Solomon built the first temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians, where Zerubbabel rebuilt that temple and destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans.
The burning of the temple took place on the 9th of Av, or Tisha B'Av in Hebrew. That day is to come and wail for the destruction of the temple. And you may see even people sitting and crying. An event which took place almost 2,000 years ago. And they still feel it as if it was yesterday.
And this is an extremely sensitive place. And because of this, the archaeological spade has never touched it. Even without excavations, though, there's plenty of archaeological evidence that can be seen. So what I want to do is I want to back up. I want to go through the biblical account of all that's happened on top of Mount Moriah. And when we bring the historical and the archaeological evidence together, then the authentic location for Mount Moriah is extremely obvious. So please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out, helps get the content out. Also, the site that I'm covering today is Chapter 2 in my book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. Thanks to all of you who have been ordering it. You've made it #1 on Amazon in Archaeology. And I will leave a link in the description below where you can order a copy of the book. The Lord tells Abraham in Genesis 22:2, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. On a mountain I will show you." So Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his son on a mountain that God will show him in the region of Moriah, and thus Mount Moriah. So Abraham and Isaac are making their way up the slope of Mount Moriah, and Isaac is noticing that they have the fire and they have the knife, and he asks his father, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb." So when Abraham reached the place that God had told him about, that is the top of Mount Moriah, then it says that Abraham built an altar there. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Do not lay a hand on the boy." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. The lamb that the Lord provided was sacrificed in place of Abraham's son. This is a substitutionary sacrifice. The lamb died as a substitute for Isaac. In other words, the lamb died so that Isaac could live. So moving forward in history in 2 Samuel chapter 24, we learn of a similar event that happened to King David. 2 Samuel chapter 24 says, "The Lord sent a plague on Israel. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, 'I have sinned.' The Lord told David to go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen. David built an altar to the Lord and sacrificed burnt offerings, and the plague on Israel was stopped." So again, we have here a substitutionary sacrifice. We have the oxen dying for the sin that David had committed. This plague that was against Israel stopped when this sacrifice took place. In other words, the oxen died so that Israel could live. Now, the key verse for knowing where these places were located is 2 Chronicles 3:1. 2 Chronicles 3:1 says, "Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." The only two places in the Bible that the name Moriah is mentioned is in Genesis 22:2, where Abraham is shown the mountain in the region of Moriah, Mount Moriah, where he builds his altar. And then in 2 Chronicles 3:1, we have Solomon begin to build the temple on Mount Moriah. So also in 2 Samuel 24:18, David builds his altar on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And then in 2 Chronicles 3:1, then we have also mentioned the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, where Solomon is building the temple. So 2 Chronicles 3:1 tells us that all three of these places are one and the same. The place where Abraham built his altar on Mount Moriah is the same place that King David later built his altar on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, which is also the place that Solomon builds the temple, which also has a sacrificial altar. And so the top of Mount Moriah is a very sacred place, and the theme that holds all these building projects together is as a place of sacrifice. So earlier in 2 Chronicles 2:6, we're given the purpose of the temple, where Solomon says that the temple was a place to burn sacrifices before God. I thought this would be something interesting to get the perspective of a rabbi on. So I sat down with Rabbi Ken Spiro to ask him about the purpose of the temple and the sacrificial system. Leviticus 17:11 says, "For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." What about, like, for example, Leviticus 17:11, where it says that is for atonement, that the life of the animal is in the blood, and that
That's
for-
part of this idea. Again, it's not the notion of God's happy now, he's got his meat, but rather it's my recognition that I've done something that damages the world. This animal this should be me. This should be me. It's seeing a life taken, even of a living being. I would say the temple's a tool to achieve atonement.
And obviously that has a lot to do with animal sacrifice. I mean, thousands and thousands of animals were sacrificed in the temple system. And does the shedding of the blood of these animals, does that have to do with atonement, with forgiveness of sins?
Well, again, that's a very interesting topic. The word for sacrifice in Hebrew is korban, which comes from the word karev, which means to bring closer.
Here's how korban works. When the blood of an animal is applied to your sin, then God forgives you. This removes the sin that separates you from God, allowing you to draw close to Him.
What's the purpose of sacrifice? So if you look back at the word, which is karev, which is to come close, then the purpose of the sacrifice is for us to build a relationship with God. And people find that very weird, even religious Jews who understand that that's an ideal.
This is why it's so devastating when we have in 2 Kings 25:9 that the Babylonians set fire to the temple of the Lord. The one place that the Israelites were allowed to offer these atoning sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins had been destroyed, and the people had been exiled. This is also when they were allowed to come back from exile from the decree of Cyrus, why the first thing that they wanted to do was to go back to Jerusalem, back to the ruins of the temple, and rebuild the temple and reinstitute the sacrificial system. Ezra chapter 6 says that King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices. Let the governor of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site and repair its ruins. We learn in Ezra that the exiles, when they returned to Jerusalem, they weren't doing a new thing. They weren't building a temple in a brand new place. What they were doing is they were rebuilding the temple on its spot. What does that mean? It means that they built the second temple on the same spot that the first temple had previously stood. And that's why it also describes the rebuilding of the second temple as repairing the ruins of the first temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. We're told by the 1st century AD historian Josephus that Herod, meaning Herod the Great, started to enlarge the temple. He didn't build a different temple in a different location. He took the temple that was already standing and simply enlarged and glorified it. And this was the temple that was standing on the Temple Mount at the time of Jesus.
This is Herod's Temple Mount. This is the very Temple Mount which was witnessed by Jesus.
After Jesus was crucified, is it true that Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed?
Crucifixion took place in Jerusalem around the year 33 of the Common Era. The Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans following the first revolt, which started in 66 of the Common Era, and 4 years later, in the year 70 of the Common Era, the temple got burned down by the soldiers of Titus. And after the battles ended, Titus and his army, his engineering forces, intentionally ruined the entire city of Jerusalem, as well as the focal point of Jerusalem, that's the Temple Mount, which is the heart, soul, and spirit of Jerusalem.
Jerusalem has such a rich history, and it's been destroyed so many times, and so many sieges against it and attacks against it. Would you consider this particular event to be one of the most dramatic that has ever happened here in Jerusalem?
Listen, those stones just behind me and behind you here are very talkative. They tell us a story, which is a most dramatic story, the most touching story. Looking at the stones, I can hear the voice of the sound of the stones collapsing and breaking the slabs of the street. I can hear the people around shouting. I can hear the hussing of the flames around. So with a little bit of imagination, those stones can become even more talkative than they are. You know, this is the most tragic event in the national historical memory.
Around AD 130, the Roman Emperor Hadrian built a shrine on top of the Temple Mount. Jerome wrote, "In the place of Jerusalem, give me a place which I might build a sanctuary." And the bishop responded, "It is the rock, and was a temple for the Israelites." So then it was a little bit later in AD 692 that another caliph named Abd al-Malik built the Dome of the Rock. And so, but it's important to understand that the Dome of the Rock marks the location. It was chosen as a location for where previously the first and second temple had stood. Over the course of thousands of years, on top of Mount Moriah, on this specific place, we have where Abraham built an altar, where David built an altar, where Solomon built the temple, where Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple, where Herod enlarged the temple, where Hadrian built a shrine, and where the Islamic Caliph Abd al-Malik built the Islamic shrine that has marked the location of where these previous building projects have taken place for over 1,300 years. Here are some examples of the archaeological evidence that can be seen on and around Mount Moriah, starting with the latest evidence and working our way back through time. The Dome of the Rock takes us from the present back to AD 692 when it was built. Located just to the north of the western wall, in a prayer hall under this building, are large arches built by Hadrian around AD 130 to give access to the shrine that he constructed on top of Moriah. This pile of stones came from the buildings that stood on top of the Temple Mount. These buildings were destroyed by the Romans in AD 70 and pushed off the Temple Mount platform. The masonry of the western and southern Temple Mount walls dates to the time of Herod the Great. Herod extended the western and southern sides of the Temple Mount platform that already existed. You can still see a seam in the masonry that identifies the place where Herod's extension began. The masonry south of the seam is Herod's addition. North of the seam, some of the masonry belonging to Zerubbabel's Temple Mount still remains. The steps leading up to Herod's temple are seen here. This is one of the entrances to the Second Temple, and you can see the original steps here and some restoration of the steps. Some of the most dramatic evidence of the Babylonian destruction has been excavated here. Walls built by King Solomon have been unearthed here. We are in between the city of David and the Temple Mount here, and you see this tower here that's attached to a wall. And you see the later masonry above here, and then you see the older masonry down below, which is from the time of Solomon. These are the tower walls that Solomon built to extend the city of David to the north, to take in Mount Moriah and build the temple on top. Though the location of David's altar can't be excavated, the city of David just to the south of the Temple Mount has been excavated extensively. David's palace was unearthed here. Layers found beneath the city of David date back to when the city was called Salem, which is when Abraham built his altar. The rock peak of Mount Moriah is the oldest physical evidence, which is hidden today beneath the Dome of the Rock. This is the rock that the Dome of the Rock is named after. So despite the fact that the Temple Mount itself has not been excavated, there's plenty of visible evidence from all the periods we have covered, left behind from the various events that happened on Jerusalem's holy hill. There is a teaching amongst Christians that's gained in popularity that argues that the temple did not stand on the traditional Temple Mount. And this is based on Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the temple, where he says that not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be cast down. So I'm standing just off the western wall of the Temple Mount, the western wall because it's the wall that's facing towards the west. Now we have this pile of stones all along the walls of the Temple Mount. These are evidence for the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy when he said, there won't be one stone left on top of another. Now, what people are often told these days is that you look at the rows of stones that make up the Temple Mount platform itself, and they say, well, that can't be the Temple Mount because Jesus said there wouldn't be one stone left on top of another. Well, in order to understand the context of what Jesus is prophesying against and what he's not prophesying against, we need to understand what the Temple Mount is. So what we're talking about is the Temple Mount is a platform upon which the buildings were built, including the temple. And then when those buildings were destroyed, then those stones were cast down off of the platform.
That is very true. The Temple Mount is actually a mountain, a dome-shaped hill, which is put into a very large bottomless box. The box is made of retaining walls, gigantic retaining walls, sometimes a quarter of a mile long, and these retaining walls have behind them artificial fill between the wall itself and the slope of the mountain. That enabled to form a kind of a platform, a flat terrain, rather than a rounded dome-shaped hill.
Before Solomon could build a temple on top of Mount Moriah, he first had to build a Temple Mount platform, upon which he could then build the temple and his palace. Herod the Great extended the Temple Mount platform to the west and south. Here we see a distinction between the Temple Mount platform itself and the buildings that stood on top of it. Mark chapter 13 says, as Jesus was leaving the temple, his disciples said to him, "What massive stones! What magnificent buildings!" Notice they are specifically referring to the buildings. "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." At the time of Jesus, the two magnificent buildings that were on top of the Temple Mount were, of course, the temple itself, and then the royal stoa. And Jesus spoke of these buildings that not one stone would be left on top of another. They all would be cast down. Well, what does that mean? Cast down off of what? Cast down off of the Temple Mount platform. And that's exactly what happened to the buildings up there, just as Jesus prophesied. They were destroyed, not one stone was left on top of another. They all were cast down off of the Temple Mount and came crashing down on this Roman street that I'm standing on now. That pile of stones came over this whole area here, but these stones were removed during archaeology to get down to the street level that you see here. And look at the impact that we have the evidence for in this street, from where those stones came down off of the Temple Mount and smashed into this street level here. This is amazing archaeological evidence for the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. I wanted to bring out how obvious this evidence is. And so what I did was I interviewed the Israeli archaeologist Gabi Barkai. Gabi Barkai is Jewish. He's not Christian. He believes in the historical Jesus. He does not believe that Jesus is the Messiah.
Listen, I'm very objective. First of all, I'm an archaeologist, and I'm not Christian. So I couldn't care less.
And so I interviewed Gabi Barkai in the pile of stones, the evidence to show how obvious it is, even to him, that the words of Jesus came to pass. We're sitting here amongst this pile of stones, and I wanted to ask you, is there any archaeological evidence for the prophecy of Jesus and the destruction of the temple that there wouldn't be one stone on top of another?
This is the evidence. This is the evidence. Look at it. It speaks for itself. There is evidence in front of our eyes to the prophecy that came through. The temple and the entire city of Jerusalem were brutally destroyed by Titus in the year 70 of the Common Era. The destruction was intentional, pre-planned, and not a single building of Jerusalem was left, and not a stone upon a stone of the temple remained. So the destruction took place, and you can see the evidence right in front of your eyes.
Now, the other claim is that the Temple Mount is actually the Antonia Fortress. And again, we have to understand not only the purpose of the temple, but also the purpose of the Antonia Fortress. The Temple Mount platform has two polar opposite corners, the southeast corner and then the northwest corner. So this is the southeast corner of the Temple Mount, and the one that is the highest from ground level. We were just at the southeast corner, now we're at the northwest corner. The southeast corner is the highest off of the ground, and actually this northwest corner actually cuts into the bedrock, as you see behind me here. This is where the Antonia Fortress stood. Now, why did it stand here? Because this was the weak place of the Temple Mount. When Jerusalem was being attacked, this corner especially needed defense. And so there was a huge fortress here in order to provide that defense. To make the whole Temple Mount the Antonia Fortress doesn't make any sense. And then where is the temple itself? Oh, well, they say over the city of David. Well, the city of David has been extensively excavated, and the occupation layers from the time of the first and second temple period have been uncovered. And so how are people living in the city, in their houses, in their buildings, occupying the city if there was a whole Temple Mount covering at least a major portion of the city with a temple on top of it? It doesn't make any sense. It wasn't the Antonia Fortress that was the big deal in Jerusalem. It was the temple that was the heart and soul of Jerusalem. The authentic Mount Moriah is the Temple Mount because the temple was built on Mount Moriah. So of all the hills of Jerusalem, which one would be the authentic Mount Moriah? Well, how about the hill that has these ancient, massive retaining walls built around it? How about the hill that is literally covered by layers and layers of archaeological evidence that was left behind over thousands of years from the various events that took place on this sacred ground? And one thing that's very interesting is the close proximity between two events that we have in the Bible. The first is what happens on Mount Moriah, where Abraham comes up and builds an altar and then offers Isaac on that altar, but is provided a substitutionary sacrifice with a ram caught in the thickets. And so he sacrifices that ram in place of his son, Isaac. That happens here on Mount Moriah, which is marked by the Dome of the Rock today. Just to the right of it here, you see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the two silver domes. The silver dome closest to us with the cross on top, that marks the place of Jesus' crucifixion. This is the place where God provided a substitutionary sacrifice in the Lamb of God, the Son of God, and that is where he died for the sins of man. So think about how close these two events took place. I want to end with two profound events that also took place on Mount Moriah. The first one is found in John chapter 2. John chapter 2 says, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. Think about this. This is the same place that God provided Abraham a lamb to die instead of his son Isaac. And in the same place now, Jesus is talking about the temple of his body, that he will die instead of us. So what Jesus is claiming is that his body is the superior temple that will provide the superior atonement. And the question then is this found in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament? And the answer is clearly yes. And probably the best example is Isaiah chapter 53. So the Israelite prophet Isaiah is prophesying about the coming of a person, this Messiah, and he calls him a suffering servant. And he says that the iniquity of us all will be laid on him, that he will be led like a lamb to the slaughter, and that he will be cut off from the land of the living. And then he says this, the Lord makes his life an offering for sin. This is substitutionary sacrifice. The Messiah would die instead of us. This is why, speaking of John the Baptist in John chapter 1, verse 29, when John saw Jesus coming, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world." This is the one Isaiah spoke of in Isaiah 53. This is the one who will become a sin offering on our behalf. We know that Jesus didn't die on Mount Moriah. Hebrews 13:12 makes it very clear that Jesus suffered outside the city gate. Jesus was crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem. But at the moment that he died, it affected a specific place. And that place was inside the city. That place was on top of Mount Moriah. And that place was inside the temple itself. Matthew chapter 27 says that when Jesus gave up his spirit, at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The sacrifice of Jesus was the ultimate korban. This is why, when the curtain is ripped from top to bottom, allowing man who has now been forgiven of sin to enter into the Holy of Holies, the very presence of God, to enter into intimate relationship with God, both in this life and the life to come. And how do we enter in? There's just one way, through the blood of Jesus. I hope that this video was meaningful to you. It's very supportive. If you go ahead and hit that subscribe button, it really helps get this content out there. I'll leave a link in the description below where you can order a copy of my book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. You can watch another video here. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Okay, do you guys remember, we're not quite done yet, we will in a second. You guys remember when he said no archaeological spade has been allowed to dig in the Temple Mount? Well, something happened in the late 90s that actually allowed for some of the archaeological work to be done. Some call it a crime that took place, but it actually afforded for us to find, for not us, but for archaeology to find a lot of different things that support what we find in the scriptures. So we've got about a little 5-minute video to finish up with.
King came, he pushed the city up the hill so that he built the temple on the very top. So with these layers of history, you've got the original Jebusite city that David captured. He expands that city to the point where it becomes Mount Zion, the city of David. But then Solomon takes it to a whole new level. And the city grows to the point where he has to continue moving up toward Mount Moriah. That's right. He wanted to put the temple as high as he could in the city to give proper reverence to God. The splendor of Solomon's temple was world-renowned from biblical accounts. We don't have that temple remade, and that was destroyed millennia ago. King Herod built the second temple. That's not even standing anymore. So when people talk about how do we know there was a Solomon, how do we know that he actually built anything, what's left? I think we need to talk to people who are authorities on the matter. There have been some things found, and I think what's really interesting is how those things were found. Within recent years, there's a project that's been going on in Jerusalem in which they've been able to go through a lot of rubble that's been found underneath the Temple Mount. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Barkai, lives here in Jerusalem, and I think it'd be beneficial to talk to him.
In 1999, as a result of certain political developments, there was a criminal act taking place. I would call it an archaeological crime. A gigantic pit was dug without any scholarly supervision in the southeastern part of Temple Mount under the excuse of an emergency effort. They removed approximately 400 truckloads of earth. That earth was dumped in the Kidron Valley. From there, we moved the soil here. This is the place where the first stage of sifting took place.
How did you know that the earth had been moved from the Temple Mount?
Eyewitnesses that followed the trucks and came there. The second way of proving it is via the internal contents of the soil. For example, we have several thousands of gilded wall mosaic tesserae, which once decorated the Dome of the Rock. It could come only from the Temple Mount. We have even a seal of the Islamic Trust of the Temple Mount.
Dr. Barkai was able to take us down and explain that they currently process not only the fill that was brought over from the Temple Mount, but they also process and sift material from all sorts of archaeological sites around Israel.
This is the place where the larger stones are removed from the contents of the soil. This is done like this.
I see.
Every one bucket goes in here,
Yes.
and it is subdivided into 3/3. The rest of the space in the bucket is taken by the water.
Okay.
1/3 soil, 2/3 water.
How long does it soak?
Several hours.
Several hours. As you know, there are people that question whether the first kings of Israel were historical figures or legendary, and whether there's anything that we can tie to that period of time. And it sounds like that you have found some incredible things.
Listen, I'm a Jerusalemite for the last 68 years. I was not around some 3,000 years ago, so I cannot testify for David living here or being here. On the other hand, if I read the scriptures well, there are so many things there which seem to be a reality. I'm dealing with archaeology, I'm dealing with material culture. Solomon built an official compound made up of the king's palace, the construction of which took 13 years. There was the house of the forest of Lebanon, the house of Pharaoh's daughters, there was the great court, there was the other court, there was the house of the Lord. All that becomes alive when we sift through the material originating in the Temple Mount. We have abundance of pottery. We have a plethora of other finds from First Temple period. The period cannot be denied. Again, I was not an eyewitness. I didn't meet them personally. Meeting the material culture of that time and meeting the texts, I have the feeling as if I should have had.
So even though there was no archaeological spade that was allowed because of that illegal excavation, they have found a lot of material that has fit the time periods and the descriptions that we find in the scripture. So pretty remarkable stuff. We are out of time. Appreciate your patience, and we'll see you next week.